Hello and welcome. I'm Alex Patanka. I'm the director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute in Washington, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's event on the Iranian government's policies on population growth. I guess let me just set the stage, and I'm fairly sure I'm not going to say anything that's controversial, but the fact is that the Islamic Republic has in various ways engaged in social engineering since this Iranian system came to power back in 1979. The list is long, from imposing mandatory veiling for women, keeping religious minorities out of certain sensitive roles, politicizing the education system of the country, and so on and so on. So the list is long. But today's topic is a case of another attempt at social engineering, but this one on a huge scale. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, wants the population to grow from 85 million to 150 million. It's quite a task, and that's what we're going to discuss today. The questions that we're going to tackle are: what sort of ambitions drive Ayatollah Khamenei? Is it at all possible? And what sort of impact will such a population growth have on Iranian society? To discuss all this, we have a wonderful panel of three experts and keen observers on Iranian politics, society, and the issue of population growth specifically. In the interest of time, I will introduce them alphabetically, and briefly, you can see their full bios on the MEI's website. We'll start off with Nader Shamlou, former senior advisors to the World Bank and current non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Then we have Firuzeh Kashani Sabet. She's a Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania and author of Conceiving Citizens, Women, and the Politics of Motherhood in Iran. Last but not least, we have Farzaneh Rudi, former director at the Middle East and North Africa division of the Population Reference Bureau. Just a few points from me before we start. To submit your questions, please use the Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please email events@mei.edu. I do encourage everybody to ask questions throughout the panel. I'll be looking out for your questions. I'll bring them into the conversation when we can, and very much look forward to the same conversation and discussion. So let me start and turn to our panelists and start with Nader Jan. Let's start with the most, I guess, obvious question: why these pro-natalist population policies at the moment? Why are they needed right now in Iran's history?
Well, thank you, Alex, and thank you for organizing this webinar and this panel. I want to first and foremost wish everybody a happy Nowruz and a very joyful year ahead for you and your loved ones. Yes, population policies are very, very important for any country and for the world as a whole, because I think it is important to note that humankind, the world is entering an unprecedented era in its history, an increasingly aging population, and combined with the shrinking population that we expect, this situation has an important impact on every society on our planet. Whether it is sociological or economic, an aging population has severe ramifications that many nations must deal with, including Iran, and therefore it has very important long-term as well as short-term implications. Now, what are the causes and consequences of an aging population, and why is it that we're facing this issue now? I think more than any other time in history, the aging population of the world is the result of a continued improvement in health circumstances, which I mean, and thank God we all live longer and are able to enjoy our children and grandchildren more for a longer period of time. But then also a declining fertility. In the past, people used to have 6 or 7 children. Now, you know, you're lucky if you have two children or 2 grandchildren, or whatever it is. And as a result of that, there are demographic changes that are profoundly impacting every aspect of the society. So what are some of the economic what issues are countries dealing with as a result of this, what people call graying population? That means that the increase of the share of population over the age of 60. With an aging population, for instance, you know, in Japan or even in Europe, as well as in North America, we face this issue as well. There is the trend is that there will be a decline in working age population, an increase in healthcare costs, an unsustainable commitment for pensions that most pension plans cannot support, and of course also a very important change or driving change in demand, in what kind of services, goods and services are being produced in the economy. And the economic consequences of an aging population is, of course, a slow growth, a slower GDP growth, because as working age populations decline, there is going to be a smaller workforce, of course. And in addition to that, there is going to be a greater share of public budgets that must be dedicated to the care and to the burden of the care of the retirees and old age population, because with all of these diseases like cancer and Alzheimer's and many other of these diseases that afflict more the aged rather than the young, the healthcare costs are going to go up, and they're going to be a burden on budgets. Now, the economic, I would like to share with you a screen. I have just very few slides that I want to share with you and bring this issue down to the situation of Iran. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay. So let me show you the population structure of Iran. Let me see whether I can do this. Okay. Can you see the population structure of Iran? Here on this screen is the population structure of Iran. As you can see, the older age, essentially the group that is getting into an older age is increasing, but the bottom is narrowing down. I wanted to juxtaposition that vis-a-vis some of the advanced economies, such as Germany, which is here on the top, on the top here. You know, the other one is Japan. Japan has one of the worst situations, has one of the eldest. Actually, it has the eldest population in the world. We have here China, we have here, France. All of these advanced countries have population policies that are integrated into their economic policies. So as a result, what I would like to say is that, yes, it is important for Iran to have a population policy, but whether it is a population policy that is 100 million or 150 million, that needs to be debated, because it has also to take into account the resources that the country has available and the resources that the country has available for to sustain its economic growth, as well as its not only just the quantity of growth, but also the quality of growth, you know, like poverty alleviation and so on. But there is also another important facet that needs to be taken into account, in addition to economic sustainability, to economic factors, and the other one is just security, national security. And here it must be borne in mind that wars are very often about demography. Demography determines wars. And let me just go to the next page that I want to show. Somehow it's not working. No.
We see Iran.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. So as you can see, I mean, demography is a core part of war. And the war is often, you know, as we see today, is often sort of like, you know, conducted between neighbors. And it is important to have a population policy that takes into account the replenishment of a fighting force, because it is important, of course, to have a good sized population, but also what age groups are there. For instance, you know, more and more as we see, you know, the elderly and children cannot participate to the fighting of wars, but the majority of the fighting is done by, you know, traditionally it was done by men between the ages of, you know, 18 to 40 or 45, and now increasingly, as we can see in many wars, as well as in Ukraine, by women in this age group. So having for the security of the country, having a young population is very important. And here I'm showing Iran in comparison to its neighbors. And as you can see, the population pyramid of Pakistan, which has about 100, I think it is close to 170 or 80 million people, has a very huge, large, young population. The same thing is with Iraq, and the same thing is with Afghanistan. So Iran, in terms of the population threat that it faces from its neighbors could be considered, I mean, that threat could be considered significant, because as Iranian population ages, it would have fewer and fewer people who could fight in a war. And of course, it has some very populous countries in its neighborhood, perhaps less in terms of Turkey. Turkey is perhaps less of a threat, but certainly it has it faces a greater threat by larger population of its by the larger population of its neighbors, particularly the population combination or whatever construction of its neighbors. I want to stop here and hand it over to the other speakers, but I just wanted to highlight that having a population policy is important for economic growth, economic security, but it's also important for national security. So as a result of that, it is important that Iran has a population policy. The question that I would like to maybe address later is, how do we achieve that population policy, and whether the incentives that have been given are the right incentives and are going to be giving resulting in the goals that we need to reach. And with this, I stop, and I will stop also the sharing of my.
Thank you, Nader. We will have more slides coming up. Farzaneh has some slides too. Farzaneh, it's a great segue to what I think you will be speaking to. But you know, when we advertised this event, one of the data that we used was Iranian women used to have on average, I believe it was 6.2 children in the 1990s, and today is 1.9. In a span of 30 years is a major decline. I don't know if this is unique, but let's turn to you. I mean, what happened in the 1990s? Because I think that was one of the things you wanted to talk about, and your slides are ready. So you're good to go.
Thank you. That's a good question, and that's important to understand what happened in the 1990s in order to understand Iran's aging population, and today how fast it's aging, and what the government can do or wants to do, what's the right thing to do and what is not the right thing to do. And if we can go to the next one, slide, please. What happened was that the Iran-Iraq war ended in 1988, And around the time that the war was ending, the result of 1986 census came out, showing that Iran's population was growing very rapidly at 3.7% a year, one of the highest population growth rate in the world. And at the same time, the government was collecting a lot of data about for the reconstruction of the country after the war, what they need to do, how much money and they didn't have much money to do. And they saw this rapid population growth as an obstacle to economic development. And they made a U-turn soon after the revolution. They had dismantled Iran's family planning program, and then after the war, when they wanted to have population control policies, and they revitalized the family planning program and turned it into the most successful family planning program. I should say voluntary family planning program in the history. And the population was growing very rapidly. It was because mortality has declined, particularly mortality among infants and children, and which is shown in this graph. If we go to the next graph, and then in the 1990s, fertility declined very rapidly. But this was totally to the surprise of the government and everyone, the world. It was surprised because the development community, international development community, they spend so many millions of dollars every year and to help countries to improve women's and maternal health and reduce fertility and all these. And Iran did it on its own and with only less than 1% foreign assistance that was from UNICEF helping with child mortality and all this. And this came as a surprise even to the government. The first 5-year development plan that it was implemented after the war, they had the goal of reducing fertility, listen to this, to 4 children per woman by 2011. But then by 2000, it was already down to 2. So yes, this was because people, women, couples, men demanded it, needed this kind of, the government removed the social and economic obstacle to use of family planning, and they made them all the services available for free. And many fatwas in support of use of family planning was coming out. And many of those fatwas actually came from Khamenei, Ayatollah Khamenei. And if we go to the next one, please, as another region showed, it changed the age structure of Iran. I only want to make a kind of point that on the lower left pyramid, where we see that it at the bottom is start to expand, this doesn't mean that fertility was increasing. This means because we have more women in reproductive age, as you see in the bulges, that they give birth to children, but that doesn't mean that the fertility was increasing. If we go to the next one, please. This fertility decline, as another region talk about it, how it impacts the age structure of the population. This is one way of looking at it, that in 1986 in Iran, almost half of the population were under age 15. And by 2050, it's expected that 20% of the population, 1 in 5, to be age 65 and over. If we go to the next one, and if we compare it with other countries now, by 2050, Iran will be, and its age structure will be somewhere between US and Japan. Egypt is an interesting country. I mean, Egypt, Turkey, and Iran are the most populous countries in the region, and usually they are compared with, Egypt now, it has 1/3 of its population under age 15. We go to the next one, and next slide. And Iran and Egypt in 1990, they had the same population size. And now Egypt has almost 20 million more people than Iran. This means that Iran, if had the fertility pattern that Egyptian women had, there would have been 20 more million people in Iran, and all of them under age 30. I'm not totally 100%, because I come from another perspective to the population issue with Nader June, that just having large population, that means a country is stronger. Just imagine Iran's today had 20 more million people, that they were all under, this additional 20 million were under 30, with all the education, healthcare, and all this that they needed, and entering the job market. Now unemployment is so high, imagine if they had. So the quality of how much of the economy can absorb, how much the government can provide for the basic care of people, that's important. The last slide quickly that I want to show, the median age, compare median age of Iran and Egypt. And in 1990, half of Iran's population was under age 17, as compared to Egypt, that was 20%. Today, 32, I'm sorry, I said percent, no. Yeah, half of the population. Now, today, half of the population of Iran is under age 32, and Egypt is 25. And I stopped there, and just the last, I believe this fertility decline in Iran was the best thing that happened to Iran, because that's how it could build resilience that could face all the sanctions through these years, and not to be bogged down with a kind of runaway population growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Farzaneh John. Thank you so much.
Excuse me, Alex, can I just quickly clarify? I don't disagree at all with what Farzaneh John said. What I meant is that a population policy is important for various, for economic as well as national security. But what the sort of like the magical number is, that's something that needs to be discussed. And I don't know whether it's 83 million, it's 75 million or 100 or 100. That needs to be studied. But I fully agree with Farzaneh John that you need to take into account the resources that you have available, the
right.
resources that because it's just not enough to have a very large population. It's
right.
important to have a very good population.
Right.
Sorry.
Right.
That's what I wanted to add.
Very quick comment from me, and I'd love to sort of maybe talk about the region later on. I think we will talk about the region, but I mean, one of the reasons, for example, the country of Egypt, which was just mentioned by Farzaneh John, one of the reasons Egypt is not playing such an active foreign policy role in the Middle East today as compared to some other countries is because it's got a 100 million plus population it needs to look after. So you kind of have to play your policies based on what resources you have. But Firouzeh John, your turn. If you want to go ahead and get your slides, I think you had slides as well. One of the things, Firouzeh, while you get your slides ready, that I thought you would perhaps speak to is this issue of the role of ideology in all of this. If I remember my numbers right, 1979, when this Islamic Republic is born, Iran's population is just under 40 million, if I remember right. Today's 85 million almost. So a majority of Iranians were not even around when this Islamist system was born. And I wonder what they make of all of this, given the situation in terms of the economy in Iran, what they make of the mandate from above to have more children, where the economy can't sustain so much of what is required to have a normal economic life in today's Iran. But anyway, that's just some comments from me. Firouzeh John, welcome. Please go ahead. Your slides, we can see them, and floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Alex. I'd like to begin again also by thanking my co-panelists, Nadere and Farzaneh, and Alex, of course, and all the individuals at the Middle East Institute who have made this opportunity possible. And I echo everyone's, Happy New Year, Happy Nowruz wishes for everyone here and out there. So thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. My perspective is obviously that of a historian. And so I kind of take a slightly different tack in trying to address some of the points that were raised and some of the questions just that Alex has just also brought to our attention. And so I'm going to go through, I don't have very many slides because we want to kind of make it more free-flowing conversation, but just as a preamble to sort of my perspective on the question and the work that I've done to date on it. Oops. Okay, yeah, sorry. Here we go. So I wanted to, again, from a historical perspective, the question of population control or, fears of population growth have been around since at least 1798, when Robert Malthus published his very well-known and controversial essay called The Principle of Population. And of course, the Malthusian sort of conversation, generate a lot of discussion and sort of different responses to the issue of population. And in Europe, as well as in Iran and other parts of the world, including the Middle East, throughout the 19th century, there was a real fear and there was a real sort of perception and also a reality of the crisis of infant mortality. So I think it's important to remember in some ways that some of these conversations grew out of very real social problems. And one of those social problems actually was infant mortality. And so in Iran too, as I tried to document, it was very, very difficult to document actually infant mortality. And so, our existent sources really didn't have a lot that offered information on it, but we could sort of glean things from, visitors to the country and so forth. I think the long and short of it actually is that infant mortality was very prevalent. Couples tended to have more than 2-3 kids in general, but those children, many of them did not survive. And so, sometimes that was used as a reason or sort of argued as one of the reasons why, couples and women should have more than, 2 or 3 kids. By the 1940s, and, in the interwar period from, even through the Constitutional Revolution and after, and then in the interwar period, 20s, 30s, 40s, the issue of population and population growth was very much at the forefront of the state. But by the 1940s, it was still estimated that infant mortality in Iran was above 50%. And there was, I think, a substantial improvement going into the second half of the 20th century and into the sort of, the period of the Islamic Republic, where infant mortality has, in fact, declined significantly. But I think it's, part of what I wanted to sort of bring to everyone's attention is that the issue of infant mortality was very important. And so when we talk about population control and the historical dimensions of it, the two kind of did go hand in hand. Now, my co-panelists and, have also sort of hinted at this or perhaps they said it outright and I just don't remember right this moment. But population growth was often tied to nationalist policies or national policies, not necessarily nationalist. But in the case of the Middle East and actually, some European countries as well, population growth was in fact connected to this, fear of depopulation, sort of leading to or kind of causing or sort of preempting national weakness and vulnerability. And so there was this false sense that a large population meant, could be translated into more global power and therefore relevance. And so, my colleagues have actually, kind of come right out and sort of said it's not necessarily the number that you have, but also the care and sort of the resources that can be put at the disposal of a nation's population. And so the conversation gets a lot more complicated and needs to become a lot more complicated. But in an era where some of these ideas were kind of beginning to take form in a modern sense, Iran's population wasn't growing dramatically. Iran had suffered from a lot of wars in the 20th century, early 20th century, mid 20th century, from famine. Historians, have documented the terrible famines and other illnesses that were prevalent in both the First and Second World Wars, et cetera. And so these were, again, concerns that had a very specific historical context. And then, of course, that context changes as, Iran's position in, world politics to some extent changes as well. One of the things I did sort of want to point out, again, and to sort of emphasize that in many ways, Iran's own history and experience with political control is similar to what other states have experienced. Oftentimes, population policies are a form of social control over women and families. Now, there may be very real demographic, economic reasons for it, but I think we would be naive, I think, not to also at the same time recognize that there is fundamentally, a conversation. This is also fundamentally a conversation over control. It's about patriarchy. Often in the era where these types of population policies were taking shape, women were not at the forefront of it. They were not necessarily always the decision makers, although that changed obviously over time. But I think that patriarchy, and in fact, when we look at Iran, maybe in the contemporary period, how some of these issues have been devised. But also even, to some extent in the United States, we're all waiting with bated breath to see what the fate of Roe versus Wade is going to be. And so again, I encourage us all to think a little bit more broadly and not to forget that, in fact, this is a very significant part of the conversation about patriarchy and women and control over women. The other point I wanted to make is that population control is also tied to the power of the state, to politics of the state. And so oftentimes it tends to be reflective of the power that the state thinks it has or wants to show that it has over its populace. And so again, in the history of modern Iran, not just the Islamic Republic, but the, sort of the modern history of Iran, women often became the barometer of politics, whether it was the unveiling of women, whether it was the reveiling of women, whether it was, have more kids, have less kids, women were constantly being told what the heck to do. And so again, I really must emphasize that, we can't break through entirely from this sort of hold of, patriarchy over these types of social policies and conversations. And finally, again, an issue that in my view is really important to raise is how sometimes population control policies have a more sinister aim, which is to keep women out of the public sphere. Again, this is not just, I look at this issue more broadly. This is not necessarily specific to any country, but it is, again, including in this country, when you're talking about, not just abortion, but women in the workplace and, maternity leave and all of these types of policies are very much connected to women's place and role and sort of visibility in the public sphere. I just thought, one of the things that has come up is this panel. One of the questions that is asked is, what is the role that the state can play in the outcome of either population growth or fertility and so on. And, this is actually a cartoon from the 1960s in the Persian newspaper, Etalat. And, this was a time when, of course, the state was very, interested in trying to rein in, population growth in Iran. And so you see this really very sort of humorous picture of this father sort of overwhelmed with, the number of kids, that he's going to have to care for. And I think that in many ways, the anxiety, sort of the imagery here, and also the conversation behind it, also, the confusion that people were facing regarding the use of birth control pills in the 1960s, and so that's a whole nother conversation, actually, is, the efficacy of birth control methods and, how you sort of communicate that. But the larger point I wanted to play was that, both the media, as we see here, and the state actually in the short term do play an important role in communicating what information women and families and men, have access to regarding population growth and population control. And then I just thought this might be a little helpful for our audience, kind of to go through sort of the many vicissitudes of population control that Iran has experienced, certainly from the 60s onward. And the state, has taken different positions at different times. And certainly I hope that at some point, in our question and answer and the broader conversation, we'll have an opportunity to talk about everything. Thank you so much.
Alex, I think you're on mute.
Oh,
there you are. The one thing I had to get right. The one thing I had. But no, thank you, Firuze. That was wonderful. I wanted to quickly bring one question into the conversation. I don't know the answer, but the question is: what about the role of the army of 100,000 women volunteers that brought the population under control? I'm not sure what time frame this is. But maybe Farzaneh John, you can take that. But before I go back to Nadira to do another round, here's a question that would be really, I guess, important for all of you to say a few words about, if you don't mind. I think the 150 million population figure is something that Ayatollah Khamenei has been repeating for at least 10 years. I think it is at least 10 years he's been asking for it. I don't see any indicators that people are listening to the man, because they don't have to listen to him. They need to look at their pocket, how much money they have to spend, the state of the economy. So if Ayatollah Khamenei wants population growth, he's managed, in fact, through his policies to achieve the opposite, which is emigration of Iranians from the country, which takes me to Firuze's point about the power of the state. Does the state really have much of a ability to encourage population growth when all the indicators are against such a development? That people want something different, and if they can't get it at home, they're simply leaving. So I just wonder where Khamenei is coming at this, why people don't tell him the truth. But anyway, Nadira John, please follow up and respond to anything you've heard so far.
No, I mean, excellent comments by both Farzaneh Jun and Firouzeh Jun on the history, on the developments. I don't have much to add to it. I have been sort of like an observant of these developments from afar. But what I wanted to raise with you, yes, I think policies of the government work, but the question is on whom does it work, and whether it is the effect that we want to achieve. And I'd be very I can explain a little bit further. According to the literature that is out there, pro-natalist policies work, but their impact is not, how should I say, the effectiveness of the impact and the efficiency of the impact is very important, because you could throw a lot of money at these policies and achieve very little, or you could really target them very well in the sense of which group, which age group you want to target these, these policies for. Let me give you a couple of examples. For instance, when you compare Poland and Hungary, both of them have similar had similar population structures. What the policies were in Poland, in Hungary, was to give incentives for the third child. So in other words, a family that is already stressed with 2 children, you give incentives to have a third child. This policy didn't work very well because people were already stressed economically, or families were already stressed economically. Whereas, for instance, in Poland, they were more successful in pronatal policies by giving incentives for the first child. So in other words, it induced couples that had more economic potential to induce them to have their first child, to have 1 child. So in other words, what I'm saying is that it depends very much how you target them. The reason why probably Ayatollah Khamenei's 150 million number is going to be a pipe dream is because Iran just doesn't have the resources to have 150 million. Iran has hardly the resources right now because, as you know, about a third, pretty soon, maybe 40% of the population is going to fall below poverty lines. Is because of all the other policies that Iran has adopted, be it foreign policy, be it all sorts of other policies that have limited its economic growth. Right now, Iran has one of the highest economic dependency ratios in the world. Around the world, the average is that for every person that works, that person supports 1.8 other persons. So in other words, itself, his or herself, and 1.8 other people supporting. In Iran, it is 2.8. So in other words, every worker in Iran is supporting 2.8 people in the economy. Now, this is already, again, a very, very strong, a big burden. And a large part of it is because women are not participating in the workforce, because women have been, in other words, not only being given disincentives to work, but they're actually being pushed out in some senses out of the workforce. And here I refer to what Firouzeh Jan was mentioning, that there is an ideological aspect behind this policy. And what Iran's policies are to reinforce this patriarchal attitude by promoting, for instance, I just give you some examples. They're promoting early or child marriages, inducing people to marry as early as possible so that they could have children. Well, who is going to be an early childhood bride is the person who has very little education, who cannot really sustain herself in the economy. Or, for instance, they have been promoting polygamy. Again, a family that has many mouths to feed is going to be a very, how should I say, poor family. So in other words, there has been a lot of money being thrown at these sorts of promotions. I'm sure that some of it will work. It's not going to be ineffective, but the problem is that the large proportion of Iranians who have better economic resources, they certainly will not go for another child. So in other words, this policy is not going to be a very effective policy. In fact, if I can just close with this, is that in fact, when we look at pronatal policies across countries, those countries that have actually promoted women's empowerment and have promoted the women's status in their economies, in their societies, have been more successful in promoting, in having, a higher fertility rate. And in that instance, for instance, France or Sweden, they have tried to improve women's status in the workforce and also improve women's participation in the political process, and providing women with support, with the kind of support that they need in order to be able to balance life and work. In Iran, it's the opposite. They are trying to push women into motherhood by limiting their access to economic opportunities. And this is certainly going to fail. So I agree very much with what everyone else is saying. People look at their pocketbooks. If they cannot afford another child, no matter what anybody is going to do to say, they're not going to have that other child. So therefore, what I want to stress is what kind of policies. It's important to have population policy, but it is also important to know what you want to get out of it, and what you can get out of it by the resources that you can afford to pay to put to that goal. I will stop here, and maybe the next round I can take some questions or so. Thank you.
Thank you, Nader. Farzana John, the question was, I think, one you wanted to take, the role of women and the 100,000 army of women who went door to door, from what I understand, and educated Iranian women. If you could comment on that specifically, and perhaps maybe on the issue of the role of civil society. I mean, are there many organizations that do their own, if you will, policies separate to what the government wants, what Ayatollah Khamenei wants? You're mute. You have to unmute yourself.
I don't know why okay, thank you. This United Nations grouping of countries, Iran, when it comes to population issues, falls on with Asian countries, while for WHO, it falls with West Asia and Arab countries. So Iran, the UN International Conference on Population and Development that was held in 1994, Iran, it was in preparation for the conference. Iran was very active in that conference, and they kind of learned a lot from Asian countries that have experience in reducing their fertility. So they learned from their experiences, and one of them, it was these women volunteers. And all the issues that they learned from other countries, Iran implemented perfectly. It was not only copy and paste for them, they adapted, and Iran's successful family planning program, it was mainly because of its health network, the health system that existed, particularly in rural areas. And in rural areas, these health houses, they were proactive in reaching out to families and kind of meeting their basic healthcare needs. In cities, this proactive kind of reaching out to give health services to women didn't exist. So these women volunteers were created, and as to fill the gap between health centers and families. I actually visited many of these health houses and also health centers in cities with these women volunteers. And these women volunteers, actually, they were assigned 50 kind of households, and they were coming to the health center, and they helped with the health workers in the health center to prepare the files for the families as their healthcare needs are, their children's vaccinations, their contraceptives, women contraceptive. It was so successful, and women who were women volunteers liked it so much that they were involved in other activities in improving their neighborhood. They got involved for collecting garbages from their neighborhood and other things. So these women volunteers, and they were a kind of waiting list. I mean, they were more volunteer as women to work as women volunteers than they needed. So and one other aspect of Iran's healthcare system, which was very much effective and kind of to some extent unique, it's very decentralized. So each province, they could develop their own plans. So this gave kind of creativity to local people to implement what needed to be done. And the role of civil society in particular was extremely important, because they mobilized the whole population to meet their need. And I remember I went to Iran in 1999 for the first time after so many years, specifically to learn about Iran's family planning program. And I was surprised that in the boxes of cheese or olive oil, or it was the slogan of less children, happier family. These were business people and themselves who took it on their own because they saw it as to the benefit to society. And just quick note about 150 million people population, migration can help. Let's not forget about that. It doesn't have to be only fertility to increase population and migration. And maybe that's one thing that about people leaving Iran, young people. These are young people who are, if they had stayed in Iran, they would have children in Iran. So it helped not only they themselves, but giving momentum to the population growth. And one thing, I'll stop here and kind of.
Thank you, Faris. If I may, just one specific question, Firuza John, for you, and then we can start moving towards wrapping up your final thoughts. And I do have one other final question that came in that I think it's important on climate change. But Firuza, the question specifically is on the impact of the Iran-Iraq war. Roughly 250,000 Iranians, vast majority of them men, died in that 8-year conflict. Did that have a lasting impact? Was that an impact that was felt particularly in the 1990s? Is it being felt today? Any thoughts on that?
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely think that the Iran-Iraq war had a significant impact. But ironically, the family planning program actually went into effect in 1989. So right a year after the conclusion of the Iran-Iraq war. So I have a couple of thoughts about that, which is that, again, and history confirms this, that, of course, wars do have an impact on the way people view the population and the size of the population. And also, it wasn't just about the population, it was about social change. It was about, women having partners to marry, Iranian men to marry. How do you sort of deal with that demographic difference? My own sort of perspective of things, though, is, I just, again, from a historical point of view, is that, population control legislation can be successful in the short term, but it creates all other problems in the long term. And so I think that, I think that sometimes, it's important to educate people on their options, and I think that governments can play a role on educating people on their options. But I think that, legislation is a different question. And I think it comes down to sort of personal rights and people's right over their bodies and the choices that they want to make as family members, men and women building their homes. So I think that those are really sort of important, even philosophical and ethical questions that I think should be a part of this panel. We haven't had a lot of time to talk about it, but I did want to make sure I threw it in there. The other thing is there was a question that I noticed, and I'm sorry, it did sort of grip my eye, was the role of citizenship and your population. And I think that Iran has really struggled with that. I mean, my own research, other aspects of my research really have had to do with the significance of citizenship laws, sort of Iran's sort of border issues, the issue of ethnicity in Iran. And I'm not aware that the Iranian government, it's a good question, I'm not aware that the Iranian government has a particular kind of policy for certain ethnic groups and not others. But I will make one kind of comment, which I think is significant, in the way people perceive of ethnicity in Iran. It's almost like if you're ethnic, you're not Iranian. And so I sort of want to make the point that, it's sort of like saying, because we were born in Iran, for example, or we have some kind of Iranian background or heritage, we're not Americans. And so the idea of citizenship and ethnicity are different. And so some of the ways in which the government, I think, feels very vulnerable about population and counting Iranians or not counting Iranians really kind of goes at the heart of this question of citizenship. And so maybe an aspect that has to be also looked at is, sort of the politics of belonging and not belonging, of being banned, that, or who you're kind of excluding and including. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Firuza. So we have only a few minutes left, so I just want to do a quick final round, your final thoughts. But let me take that last question that we haven't had a chance to tackle yet, and maybe put that in the context of my question, which is, from your perspective, if you were offering Ayatollah Khamenei, whoever's doing the macro level strategic planning on population policy, if you asked them, listen, you've got to do a basic reality check here. You want a population of 150 million, how are you going to feed them? I mean, this last year, Iran had the worst drought in 50 years. They rely on agricultural goods coming in from, interestingly enough, two countries, Russia and Ukraine, and suddenly there's war. And they're desperately trying to look for wheat, because one of the few things left that Iranians can afford, thanks to the sanctions, is bread, because rice is becoming too expensive. So if you were doing the advising, any of you, and I'll start with Nader, the reality check, it was one final example, and I'll stop. There was a member of the Iranian Majlis in the Agriculture Committee who said just a few weeks or months ago that Iran can be a breadbasket, can feed 700 million people in the neighborhood. And that got a lot of pushback. People saying, we can't feed, we have food insecurity in parts of Iran. What are you talking about being a breadbasket? So how do you get policymakers in Tehran to face some hard facts, including on some of the things they seem to aspire for on the population front? And it goes for all of you. So take that as a question. If you want to answer it, do. If not, just wrap up with whatever you want to wrap up with. Another, go ahead, please.
Well, thank you very much for this very, very interesting closing question. Yes, I fully agree with you that there are, you hear from Iran some very, incredible statements that you wonder, which planet do some of these people live in? It's Iran is can certainly not feed 700 people. In fact, a point that I want to make is that, during this period where everybody is focusing on whether the JCPOA is going to be resuscitated or so, people are forgetting that, the rest of the world is dealing with a huge problem of shortages, of food supply shortages, to the point where, I mean, in the rest of the Middle East, or even in the rest of the world, even in Europe and in America, people are thinking about what to do with the shortages that are going to be that are the result of this war, and certainly not just today, but also going forward, when, you know, planting seasons are going to be disrupted because of the war. But coming back, if I wanted to maybe add a few points that come to my mind in the course of the discussions that the other valuable panelists put on the table. The whole issue of legislation is, I think, very important. The fact that Iranian government is now legislating, or at least has legislated, the fact that women cannot have access to countries, that families, not, I mean, and here I have to say one thing that we didn't touch on is like the role of men in the policies that has, because Iranian men have been exemplary compared to many other, at least Middle Eastern or Muslim countries, of being really at the forefront of family planning. But nonetheless, that they have actually legislated that the distribution of contraceptives is going to be punishable with long sentences or whatever. That is really worrisome, because family planning is also very tightly related to maternal health, and the health of women and so on. And the sad thing is that it's going to affect a lot of women in a very negative way. I mean, everybody talks about back alley abortions. This is going to happen in Iran, at a very high rate. So therefore, I think that one of my suggestions to Ayatollah Khamenei would be is that please do not delegislate contraceptive use, but educate people why they should have, and create the opportunities for people to have larger families. And that's why one of the things that is really sad is that the situation in Iran is such that we have now more and more educated people leaving Iran. It's precisely the kind of population, young people, young educated people that you want to keep in the country are emigrating, as Farzaneh Jun was talking about. It's going to take a long time to replace them if population is an important issue for us. And as a result, I think that there are many policies that they could apply, but I'm afraid that some of the policies that they have applied are exactly the kind of policies that they should refrain from.
Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you.
Farzaneh, your last thoughts.
Yeah. In this, the title of this law is Family Health and kind of reversing the aging population. I hardly see any aspect of it to be for family health, to improve family health. There is only a small part of it that to help couples who have difficulty bearing a woman bearing a child. Other than that, there is nothing in it to help family health. That's one thing. And following what another said about abortion, that it goes underground. Also, the contraceptives. Iranians are very good over the past 40 years, learned how to do underground businesses, and the counterfeit contraceptives that when there is no regulations and everything, it may come. That should be a worry for the government. And I personally believe that this population law is not going to be effective in the way that the government is hoping for. One reason is that there are around 80 countries and territories in the world now that whose fertility is below replacement. And none of them have experienced fertility above the replacement level since they dropped below it. So what Iran is hoping to achieve has never experienced with any countries. And even very recently, Iran, the Statistical Center of Iran, is putting out its population projections for Iran. The interesting part is that the most probable scenario that they see to happen in Iran is for fertility to drop to 1.6 births per woman. And this is a kind of government approved, despite that they put this law, population law into effect and all this. But the experts who work on data, they believe that this is the trend that will continue.
Well, thank you, Farzaneh. And Firouzja, you get the last word. Any last thoughts, please?
Well, my advice is going to be very simple, which is that I believe, the population needs to be given choices and the freedom to make their choices. And I really do believe that a big part, as I said in my presentation at the beginning, is about control. And some of that control, in fact, actually, probably all of it, has to go to the individuals making those decisions for themselves.
Excuse me, Alex, can I have one more point? I think that's important. The impact of this population law is not only on Iran and Iranian women, Iranian families. It has a negative impact for the region and Muslim countries, because particularly countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, or even Pakistan and far away Muslim countries, they were looking to Iran, seeing Iran's family planning and healthcare system as a model to follow. And now, imagine this Taliban in Afghanistan, they come and say, oh, in Iran, they limit contraceptives, so we should do it too. So Iranians have learned how to cope with all these limitations that the government puts at them. But those who have with less resources, and actually Iran's experience and Iran's during the it was helpful to Afghanistan during, decade earlier, to allow contraceptives as part of their primary healthcare because of Iran. And Iran was training Afghani refugees and family planning who were going back to Afghanistan to help Afghan women with maternal and child health. So this is going to an effect beyond Iran.
The region, yeah, great important point to finish us off with. So we're out of time. We could have spent a lot more time discussing this today. Thank you so much, Nadere, Farzaneh, and Firouzja, for your wonderful remarks, for taking the time to see us today. The one thing I took away, probably that will stay with me the longest, although you said so many insightful things throughout. The one thing is Ayatollah Khamenei needs to really have a hard look at some of the other policies in the Islamic Republic before he can wish for the population to increase to 150. I heard all of you say it's not going to happen. So let's leave it at that. Thank you for the discussion. Thanks for everyone who joined us today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And until we have another event at the MEI's Iran program, I bid you farewell. Have a wonderful week. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay.